"You're not even half the man my father is," she said. And in that instant, the room went cold, not because of her contempt, but because I knew what she didn't. I'd been secretly paying their rent for months, cutting pills in half to do it. That insult split something truer than wood. By the time I discovered my name forged onto their loan papers, love without limits had become a chain, and I had one choice left: the cut that saves the peace. Before we dive into today's story, let us know where you're watching from. And as you watch, don't just sit back, be part of the experience. If a moment grabs your attention, whether it's powerful, unexpected, or deeply moving, drop a comment with the timestamp of that scene and share your thoughts. Your reactions bring the story to life, and we love seeing which moments resonate with you the most. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Now, grab a coffee or tea, settle in, and let's begin. I'm Samuel Sam Hart, 68, a widower with sawdust in my cuffs and creases, the kind of man whose hands remember every nick they've taken. Most mornings in Asheville begin the same: kettle on, radio low, a mug of black coffee warming the bench while I test a chisel's edge against my thumb pad. The workshop sits behind my house like a faithful dog, all pine smell and old stories, a place where walnut blanks become bowls, maple boards become chairs that don't lie, and the day slows enough for memory to keep up. By 9, I'm planing quiet ribbons that curl to the floor. I make cradles for new grandparents, cutting boards for wedding registries, and hand-turned salad bowls that hold a whisper of mineral oil. On Saturdays, I set up a booth at the tailgate market and watch couples tap rims with their knuckles, smiling when the wood answers with a deep, reassuring note. People say my pieces feel like they've always belonged to their kitchens. I nod and let them believe that's design. Truth is, it's devotion. My son Andrew, Drew to most, once swore he'd take over the shop. As a teenager, he could spot cathedral grain inside a rough board and sand a curve clean without breaking its backbone. After college, he pivoted to selling used cars because that's where the quick money is, Dad. He said it with the confidence of a man who thinks time owes him interest. I let him go. A father, if he's wise, holds a door and a light, not the boy's shoes. Drew married Tessa Monroe, a woman whose polish enters a room a step before she does. She's from Charlotte, where her father runs a contracting firm with glossy signage and glossier stories. On holidays, she praises my ham and wonders aloud if I've thought about losing the farmhouse clutter. "Minimalism really opens a space," she once said, eyes skating over my pegboard as if it had personally offended her. I smiled and poured cider. Some houses open, others hold. 6 months back, Drew called sounding smaller than his driver's license photo. A deal fell through, then another. Commissions dried up. Rent came due on their South Slope apartment, and the numbers didn't make a friendly shape. I told him I would help for a spell. Since then, I've sent $1,200 each month straight to the landlord, Mr. Omar Rahman, a courteous man who thanks me from a distance and minds his ledgers. Tessa doesn't know. Truth be told, I barely let myself know. To float the money, I halved my blood pressure pills under the pharmacist's frown and sold the vintage Diston handsaw I bought in 1978 when Ruth and I were young and full of weekends. The saw fit my palm like a promise. The pawn ticket fits my wallet like a blister. There are sins of commission and of omission. A parent's most tempting sin is mercy without math. I chose quiet because I thought dignity grows better in shade. Each time I clicked submit on Mr. Rahman's portal, I promised it would be the last bridge I built for a man who needed to learn waiting. Then another month arrived with its hat in its hand. I put my head down and planned. Sundays are our treaty days. I cook what Ruth taught me to cook. Herb-roasted chicken that makes the whole house smell trustworthy, green beans with slivered almonds, and an apple pie whose crust keeps my thumbs honest. I set the table with stoneware I turned the winter she got sick and polished the flatware she insisted we save for company, as if the two of us were not company enough. I talk to her as I set places. Help me be patient, I say to the air. Help me be clear. The answers live in muscle memory, wiping a rim clean, setting forks tines up, turning the pie so its seam faces me like a compass needle. Before dinner, I sweep the shop, unhook my apron, and button a clean chambray shirt. The house looks its age in the evening, warm lamps in the windows, a mantel crowded with photographs, oak that gleams because hands have loved it. I light a candle on the table. The doorbell will ring soon. Drew will text that he's 5 minutes late. Tessa's sedan will glide to the curb like a judgment with headlights. I breathe, set out the carving knife Ruth gave me on our 10th anniversary, and keep an eye on the timer. I rehearse kind sentences the way a man checks his tools before a tricky cut. There is a way to speak truth that doesn't split the board. There is also a way to pretend kindness that ruins the piece. I am tired of pretending. On the counter waits a stamped envelope to Mr. Rahman asking him to stop accepting my transfers after this month. I'll mail it in the morning. In my pocket is a folded list. Warehouse jobs with decent hours, a pastor who helps with budgeting, a clinic that can rework my prescriptions without breaking the bank. I intend to offer Drew that path. I intend to keep my dignity on it. Out back, evening folds down soft over the Blue Ridge, and the air smells like rain and leaves. I stand at the sink and watch the last light leave the sycamores, thinking of the first crib I built and the night Ruth leaned over it and whispered a future into our sleeping child. Love is a vow. Rescue is a habit. I have been too faithful to the wrong one. The timer dings. I lift the chicken, feel its honest weight, and breathe the steam until my glasses fog. Footsteps will land on the porch. Keys will scrape. A laugh will rise. Then hush. I wipe my lenses, steady my breath, and set the carving knife where it belongs, bright against the wood. I do not know it yet, but this is the last quiet minute of the life I have been living. The doorbell chimed the way it always has, a polite note that floating houses use to warn one another of weather. I wipe my hands on a towel and open to the perfume first, citrus and something sharper, then to Tessa Monroe in a cream dress that refused to wrinkle. Her heels clipped a brisk tempo across my floorboards. Drew followed half a step behind, shoulders rounded, thumb finishing a text he didn't want me to see. He kissed the air near my cheek and let his coat slide onto the back of a chair I'd sanded smooth enough to catch light. "I've got hot cider," I said, because manners hold even when bones ache. "Smells wonderful," Tessa answered, scanning the room as if scent were a trap. "Have you ever tried a diffuser?" "Bergamot really refreshes old wood," she smiled the way realtors do when they've already measured your walls. I handed them mugs and felt steam fog my glasses. On the table, the chicken rested on Ruth's platter, skin glassed with herb and fat, the carving knife lying parallel to the breast as if the blade had always known how to wait. The pie cooled on the sill, quieting the window with cinnamon. I'd laid out our best, the stoneware I turned when winter was a sentence, the flatware Ruth told me to save for company as though we were not. Tessa drifted to the mantel, pausing at the pegboard that organizes my wrenches, measuring tapes, and the tiny block plane that never fails me. "So, rustic," she said, tasting the word. "Minimalist lighting would flatter the space. These heavy fixtures make the ceiling feel lower." Drew laughed, quick and thin, and asked how sales were. I told him about the couple from Black Mountain who had bought a cradle and left with a cutting board because they couldn't say no to the curve. He nodded to a rhythm only he could hear, already somewhere else while my story stayed in the room. The forks clinked louder than they should when I set them down. The clock, obstinate as truth, kept time in the corner. We sat. I steadied the platter with a folded towel, lined up the knife, and leaned my weight into the first stroke. The blade whispered. Tessa's voice did not. "You're not even half the man my father is." The sentence arrived like a bad cut, clean and devastating, the sort that splits through the heart of a good board and leaves you deciding between patchwork and firewood. My hand stayed on the knife. Breath lifted, caught, set down again. Drew's eyes widened and then found his lap. Somewhere the furnace hummed to say nothing had changed. Everywhere else, everything had. I pushed my chair back, not fast, not slow, and let the towel rest. "Then he can start paying your rent." "Rent? What rent?" Drew was up before he knew he'd moved, the chair legs skittering sideways with a sound like shoes on wet concrete. I kept my gaze level and my voice quiet because the shouting is a kind of waste I can't afford. For 6 months, I've sent $1,200 on the 5th to your landlord, Mr. Omar Rahman, for your apartment on South Slope. Transfers go through his portal. He thanks me by email. That's the arrangement. Tessa's poise tilted, a picture frame hung by a single nail. The color drained just enough to make the lipstick louder. Her hand curled around the stem of her cider glass and loosened, as if the weight of warm apple had suddenly become an accusation. Drew looked from me to the knife and back, as though the blade were a verdict I might deliver. I didn't itemize anything else. Not the halves of pills. Not the handsaw pawned in a shop that keeps its lights too bright. Numbers have the courtesy of honesty when they're left alone. I slid the carving knife an inch farther from the platter, palms open to the table. A father may help for a spell, I said, the words as simple as I could make them. Help cannot become a habit that erases respect. The kitchen light hummed. Steam lifted off the chicken and turned slow in the air like breath on a cold morning. In the window, the pie fogged the glass, a small weather system no one noticed. The clock's ticks grew distinct enough to count. Tessa studied the framed photographs on the mantel, Ruth in the sun hat, Drew with a slingshot, the three of us at a picnic the summer the creek ran loud. She traced each with her eyes and returned to the table. My father would never let his daughter feel small about money, she said, but softer now, as if the words were expensive. That may be, I answered, and even I could hear the caution in it. Drew cleared his throat, then again as if certainty could be coughed up. He reached for the platter and withdrew his hand, confused about what hunger required. The fork I'd laid near his plate shivered against the stoneware and settled. He looked at me the way a boy looks at a swimming hole, testing depth, wanting the bottom to be nearer than it is. I took off my glasses and wiped them clean. Not because they needed it, because movement can slow a room that's sprinting. Through the blur, I saw the house hold its breath, beams, floorboards, elderwood that has heard worse and outlived it. I set the lenses back on my nose and watched the world reassemble into lines I could trust. Let's sit, I said, the chair legs obliging the floor with a small complaint. We'll keep to the facts. No one reached for the chicken. The room had already eaten what it wanted. Tessa folded one napkin into a smaller, sharper square and placed it precisely beside her plate. Drew sank down and rested his forearms on the table like a man bracing for a wave you cannot surf or stop. I kept my hands in view. The carving knife lay exactly where I'd set it, honest metal on old wood, quiet and ready and blameless. Outside, the last daylight bled into the ridge, and the neighborhood took on that Sunday hush that pretends tomorrow isn't coming. The house felt slightly different beneath us, as if some joist had shifted, as if the weight of speaking could alter what wood remembers. I thought of Ruth's voice telling me patience is not silence, that clarity, like glue, only does its job when clamped and given time. Drew opened his mouth and closed it. Tessa stared at the flatware's faithful shine. I breathed in roasted thyme and the faint sweetness of apple and decided we would not starve for lack of food. If we were going to say what needed saying, we'd need our hands empty. I moved the platter 2 inches toward the center so we could see one another without the bird between us. The clock ticked, the light hummed. I felt the evening cross a line it could not uncross and understood with a craftsman's certainty that the next cut would decide the piece. If you're still watching and finding these insights helpful, please comment number 1 below to let me know you're with me. Keep watching. The calm you see is about to crack wide open. Silence pressed its palm over the room and held. Steam lifted from the chicken and thinned into nothing. I could hear the tiny burr in the kitchen light, the tick of the clock separating seconds like a man breaking kindling. I set my hands flat on the table, the carving knife idle in its small brightness, a tool made honest by not using it. Drew tried to outrun the quiet with questions that didn't know where they were going. How much? Which dates? Are you sure it was? The words stumbled over one another and fell. He tapped his thumbnail against the table, eyes sliding to the floor, the chair edging sideways as if it might help him slip from view. The boy who once squared a frame by eye could not find the shape of a simple number. 1,200 on the 5th, I said. 6 months, direct to Mr. Rahman. Ledger talk, nothing more. He nodded at the statement the way a drowning man nods at the shore. I had a lead this week, he said, voice turned low, then lower. Something almost came together. His shoulders told the truth his sentence wouldn't. They had been carrying nothing. Tessa sat very straight, chin up, her composure returning like a tide the moon still respected. This, Charity, keeps us stuck, she said, measuring each word. My father would never let his daughter worry about rent. She meant to launch the sentence like a flare. It rose a little, glowed, then hissed back into the dark. I didn't answer with a sermon. I reached for the folder by my elbow and set 2 pieces of paper between the plates. First, the printed bank statements with their neat columns that have no patience for stories. Second, the stamped envelope addressed to Omar Rahman, landlord South Slope, Asheville. The letter that asks him to stop accepting transfers after this month. Paper weighs more than the air around it. I watched both of them feel that weight. I have covered the rent, I said. I will not be covering it after this month. I left out any ornament that could be taken for anger. Boundaries don't need theater. Their eyes tracked the envelope as if it might move on its own. Drew's breath shortened to the kind of shallow pull men make when they've run up a hill without noticing they chose the hill. Tessa's mouth tightened. I could see in the glassy paws the memory of shoes, dinners, subscription boxes that arrived smiling. Math waits, it always catches up. I listed the costs the way a shopkeeper counts change back into a customer's hand, small coin by small coin. I cut my blood pressure pills in half and told myself walking would make up the difference. I sold the distant handsaw I bought in 1978 when Ruth and I still believed weekends were elastic and tools were heirlooms. I skipped meat on weeks when cherry slabs came dear and the 5th crept near. There are ways to say you're proud that no one hears. There are ways to keep a house standing that no one should have to notice. I said none of that aloud. I let the inventory do what it does. Drew opened his mouth and only his age came out. I lost my job 3 weeks ago. The confession made a clean sound, a nail finally driven true. He stared at his hands as if they were things he'd found. I didn't want to look small in front of Tessa. The second nail seated beside the first. I heard Ruth in the room the same way I hear a board give before it splits. Don't turn love into a chain, she used to tell me when Drew was young and I thought heroics were a kind of parenting. Help is a spell, not a system. Dignity needs friction. I've repeated those lines in my head for months, like a man tracing a blessing he doesn't quite believe applies to him. I'll discuss options tomorrow, I said. Work leads. Budget counseling, a clinic that can help me fix the prescription mess I made. I nudged the platter toward them for form's sake. Tonight is for the truth. No one reached. The room had eaten its fill of truth and was busy trying to digest it. Tessa folded a napkin into a smaller, harsher square and squared it again, aligning edges that would not align. Drew wiped his face with both palms and left a pale print where worry had sweated through. The pie on the sill had cooled from a promise to a souvenir. The kitchen smelled like time and something lost. In my wallet, the pawn ticket's edge had begun to curve, the way a paper left too long against leather learns your shape and forgives you for it. I thought of the saw in a bright case waiting for a stranger's hand. I thought of the man I was when I bought it, how he would scold me for slow arithmetic and then forgive me for being a father. Look at the dates, I said, tapping the statement. Late fees are a tax you pay to the future because you were too kind to the present. You can't afford kindness like that. Tessa's eyes flashed, but only for a second. Your help made us look like beggars. The sentence was brittle. It snapped at the end. Your choices made you look like someone else's reflection, I said in my head and left it there. Aloud, I said nothing. I have learned the difference between a reply and a cure. We sat in the kind of stillness that carpenters trust. It makes glue set, paint level, grain reveal itself. When it left clean. Tomorrow, I repeated, by practical things. Tonight, the facts in my boundary, I slid the envelope back toward me so it wouldn't be imagined away. The knife stayed where it was, gleaming without menace, proof that tools mean only what hands decide. Drew nodded, small. Tessa stared at the envelope as if reading a future no one had approved. The clock ticked. 1, and then 1, and then 1. And I had the odd sense the house had shifted under us, not dangerously, just enough to settle deeper on the footings it should have had from the start. I stood, carried the platter to the stove, and set a lid on it to keep moisture from leaving altogether. Some things you can still save if you act before the steam escapes. I turned back to them and felt tired in a way sleep can't fix. "I'll sleep fine," I said, mostly to myself, but not in a voice they could mistake. "The facts are on the table now. They have a way of uncovering other facts." The light hummed, the pie shone dull, the envelope waited. In the workshop out back, clamps held a glue up against the tug of time. I imagined them doing their quiet work while we began ours, and I understood that whatever we had been pretending would no longer hold. This was only the first crack. I slept like a man who had finally put a heavy board flat, not deep, but level. Dawn rinsed the kitchen in a shy blue, and the kettle clicked in its own time. I brewed coffee, opened the stamped envelope addressed to Mr. Omar Rahman, and read the 2 sentences I'd written last night. Plain words, no apologies. A father may help for a spell, a ledger must balance. I sealed it again, pressed the flap with my thumb, and set it by the door with my keys so I could not pretend to forget. At 9, I set 3 mugs on the table and the 1-page plan beside them. It was a carpenter's list, warehouse openings within 5 miles, a night section at the community college teaching basic carpentry, a church counselor who could lay a budget straight, and the clinic that would fix the mess I'd made having pills. Each line had an address, a name, a number, and a place for a date. I left a pencil on top of it, sharpened and ready. Drew came in wearing yesterday's expression. Tessa came too, the way a shadow attends a thing that throws it. I slid the plan forward and explained the runway. 60 days to stand up income, track applications, bring me a first stub. If I helped at all, it would be food in the pantry and gas in a tank, in kind and in writing. No cash, no secrets. The words felt less like rules than like a plumb line finally hung in a room that had leaned for years. Tessa smoothed her sleeve and told me such living was barren. She said it gently and meant it hard. Drew asked for just 1 more month and looked at the envelope near the door as if he could talk it back open. I repeated the stop date and offered to drive him to 3 places that afternoon to wait in the lot while he walked in and asked for forms I would not sign. He nodded without lifting his eyes. I walked the envelope to the mailbox, listened to it land with that small hollow thud a finished thing makes, and stood a second longer than the air required. When I came back, I printed 2 copies of last night's bank statement and slid one into a folder I labeled Hard Facts with a black marker. I left it on the hall shelf where glances could find it faster than feelings. A micropiece held. I proposed counseling, both financial and otherwise. Tessa said strangers had no business in our business. Drew said he'd consider it and then let his eyes run to her where his considerations usually end. I wrote a memo anyway, dated it, wrote what I had offered and what I would not, and left a line beneath my name for a future signature that might arrive or not. The house sounded louder in the quiet. The fridge motor kicked once and coasted. Heat moved through the vents with the steadiness of people who show up whether or not you thank them. I wrapped the cuff around my arm and took a pressure reading because I owed the truth to more than one system in this body. Numbers can be friends when you stop lying to them. The phone rang mid-morning and wrote a new line under the day. The caller ID said the bank's fraud department. The woman's voice was trained to be calm where people aren't. She asked to confirm that I had co-signed a personal loan for $8,500, opened 5 weeks ago. I told her I had not. She read off a digital signature that resembled my old hand, a contact number I recognized as Drew's, and disbursement dates that did not blush. She gave me a case ID. She did not give me any room to pretend. I stayed where I was and started moving anyway. I asked her to place a hold on the loan and flag it as disputed. I requested the full packet: application, IP addresses, device fingerprints, timestamps. While she worked, I opened the bureau websites and froze my credit with all three. I wrote the time, her name, and the case ID on a yellow pad. When we hung up, I spoke into my phone's recorder the way men talk to a dog that's gone missing. What happened, who, when, where, how, and how it made the air feel. I called Drew and Tessa back to the table. I did not bring anger. I brought paper. I set the yellow pad down and wrote a title at the top in letters larger than my usual. Elder Financial Abuse Potential. It looked like something you might see on a courthouse wall. I read the facts back, case number, dates, amounts, and where the signature should have been mine. There is a new silence houses make when they understand you are about to start labeling drawers. Drew's tears started before his sentence. He said he was going to fix it before I noticed. Tessa said it was just paperwork and everyone did it. Her voice hit the case number and bounced. I kept my hands open and flat and let the paper speak loudest. I set the boundary down in 4 nails. 72 hours for Drew to call the bank and self-report fraud, repudiate the signature, convert the loan solely to himself or unwind it, and then deliver a written apology that names the wrong thing as the wrong thing. If he did those items, I would write a mitigation letter on his behalf, noting cooperation and first offense. If he did not, I would file with the police and with Adult Protective Services and let the hallways do what hallways exist to do. I photographed the caller ID, saved the voicemail, and placed the growing printouts into a red folder I labeled Bank Fraud. The color looked right beside hard facts. I texted Mr. Rahman a courtesy note stating that all future rent conversations must go through Drew directly. He responded with a single sentence acknowledging receipt and wishing me well. I kept the message like a receipt you don't plan to return. I drank water and counted 3 slow breaths. My pulse came down because breath is a tool like any other. Tools don't ask how you feel, they ask how you'll work. I thought of Ruth's line again, how love without friction turns into a chain. I thought of the saw I sold and of a younger hand I used to own, the one that would have cut this day off at the first crooked line. People soften with time. Wood hardens. Somewhere between those two truths is adulthood. I wrote 1 sentence on a sticky note and pressed it to the red folder. Help is a spell, not a system. The words steadied the shelf like a brace. Outside, cloud cover lowered over the ridge until the light felt lidded, the way a pot simmers before it boils. The house shifted once, almost a sigh, and then held. I cleaned the table of cups and paper and left the folders in plain view because secrets rot in the dark and so do some kinds of hope. In the afternoon, I stood by the mailbox and watched a neighbor walk his dog without hurry. Somewhere, a siren tested its throat. I understood that the next hours would decide not only the loan but the shape of our days. The storm had been on its way for years. It had finally found our address. Noon arrived metallic and thin, the kind of light that makes a house show its seams. Coffee went cold beside the red folder and the black one, bank. Fraud stacked over hard facts like instruments as laid out before a surgeon enters. Half the 72 hours had already burned down to ash. I reread my own handwriting, the ultimatum lines that looked steadier than I felt, and listened to the clock define consequence 1 click at a time. The phone vibrated and threw a new kind of weather into the room. Tessa's post, neat as a brochure, floated on my screen. Artful complaint about controlling parents, a suggestion that I was withholding rent to punish. A cropped photo of my dining room that made my table look like a throne. Comments multiplied in the quick, thoughtless way flies do. 2 neighbors reacted with the kind of emojis that let people feel they've done something. I took screenshots, scrolled once more to be sure I hadn't missed a sentence that could be mistaken for truth, and put the phone face down. Online is a ditch where men drown in inches of water. I printed 6 months of transfer confirmations to Mr. Omar Rahman and their email acknowledgments, hole-punched the stack, and slid it into a thin gray sleeve I labeled Statement, Rent. No adjectives, just dates and amounts. A house can be defended with paper if the paper stays cleaner than the talk. Mr. Rahman called minutes later, voice mild, ledger solid. He confirmed he would handle all rent matters with Drew going forward and asked whether I wanted a formal letter verifying my payments. Yes, please, I said. He sent a PDF before we hung up. I filed it, then filed the feeling that something in this day had finally faced the right direction. Frank Doyle stopped by to return a clamp he'd borrowed months ago and never quite needed. He read rooms the way retired cops read parking lots. His gaze landed on the folders and stayed there without prying. He mentioned, conversational as weather, the statute language around exploitation of older adults, the usefulness of a contemporaneous log, the way case numbers like to be fed tidy steps. "Keep it simple," he said. I nodded. Understood. Frank left the clamp on the counter like a quiet endorsement of compression at the right time. By 2, I was driving to the community legal clinic, the fluorescent hush of its lobby reminding me of hospitals and other places where stories get stripped to bones. An intake attorney with careful eyes read bank, fraud, statement, rent, and my timeline, asked 3 tight questions and laid out advice without varnish. Submit an online police report to claim a case number, notify Adult Protective Services if the deadline passes, and prepare a victim statement that sticks to facts like screws to threads. I thanked her, took the pamphlet I didn't want, and drove home slow because speed is a kind of lying to distance. Back at my desk, I created a City Portal profile and opened a preliminary report. The cursor blinked in the box like a patient heartbeat while I uploaded the bank case ID receipt, a screenshot of my credit freezes, and Raman's letter. I saved the report as a draft. A thing can be ready and not yet done. That's a position I understand. I texted Drew an update, timestamps, documents prepared, hours remaining to the minute, and left the phone on the table where anyone could see it refused to ring. When they arrived, posture did the talking. Tessa's chin sat an inch higher than yesterday's. Drew's shoulders drew in as if the doorway had narrowed and he didn't want to touch it. I had cleared the table of anything a story could cling to. No chicken, no pie, no bright steel, just piles. RENTBANKLOG. I read one line from each. Dates and totals for rent. Case number and disbursement for the loan. Entries with times for the log. The room inhaled and held. Tessa called it an overreaction without looking at the papers. Drew rubbed his eyes with both hands, embarrassed by his own skin. I did not say intent. I said behavior and consequence, and let the nouns settle on their own feet. With less than 24 hours left, I set the line they could measure themselves against. If the bank had not confirmed Drew's self-report by noon tomorrow, I would submit the police report and notify Adult Protective Services. The same noon applied to his written apology, acknowledging forged consent and misuse of my identity. I slid across a single page labeled Acknowledgement and Apology, Draft. It wasn't mercy, it was structure. Someone's car idled outside for a long minute and moved on. Inside, the refrigerator motor steadied the air, a low cord I hadn't noticed I leaned on. I pinned Frank's statute note above the desk and filed Raman's verification under statement, rent. Ruth's old fountain pen, black lacquer, gold nib, went beside the laptop where the report waited. I imagined her hand around it writing grocery lists and get-well cards, and I understood something quiet about signatures and values. Drew asked if we could have more time. No, I said. He asked whether I would keep this within the family. No. He asked whether I wanted him to go to jail. I want you to meet the truth before the truth meets you. It was more words than I had planned, fewer than he wanted. Tessa said something about reputations, about how stories stick even when they aren't true. I thought about glue, how it needs pressure, stillness, and time, how it fails when you rush and touch and fret. A family is not different. Evening collected early along the windows, blue sliding into charcoal. I turned on a lamp and left the kitchen otherwise dim because clarity sometimes stands out better against a shadow. I set one plate on the table and did not fill it. The cursor on the city portal blinked patient and green. The pen rested capped, ready to make lines that would travel farther than their ink. I stood, then sat, then stood again, the way men do when they can't pretend the next act is someone else's. Tomorrow I choose the cut that saves the piece, I said to the room. Not a vow, a measurement, the kind a shop keeps, exact enough to trust, simple enough to use. The house seemed to stop floating and sit down on its frame. Outside, tires hissed on wet pavement, and a siren unfurled somewhere near the river, then wound itself quiet. I lifted the folders once more, felt their useful weight, and left the report open on the screen, asking nothing but the truth and a finger. If you're still watching and finding these insights helpful, please comment number 5 below to let me know you're with me. Stay tuned. The decision made here will change everything that follows. Morning found the house level again, as if the storm had reset the frame. The coffee tasted cleaner. I sat at the table with the red folder, the black folder, the gray sleeve, and the city portal open like a held breath. The cursor blinked, patient as a metronome. Before I chose for anyone else, I measured myself. Cuff around my arm for blood pressure, a small balance sheet on a yellow page, and the quieter ledger no one sees. Energy left after months of rescue. The standard would be the line I'd already given myself. Choose the cut that saves the peace. The email from Santa Fe arrived while the kettle exhaled. Dr. Maya Chen wrote The Way Steady Hands Move, a month-long hand tool residency for older adults, flight covered by a small arts grant, lodging in a casita behind her studio, tentative start in 1 week. I called and asked 3 plain questions: schedule, tools on site, class size, and received answers that fit in the palm of a day. "We'll make usefulness gentle," she said. "We'll make quiet count." I could hear a courtyard in her voice, sun on adobe. I wrote back that I accepted. I would travel with a chisel roll, take no fee beyond ticket and roof, and bring a willingness to sweep as well as teach. Her confirmation arrived with an e-ticket hold and a photograph. Adobe walls the color of bread crust, a small Kiva fireplace the color of kept promises. The picture warmed the kitchen more than the kettle did. Something in my chest unclenched, just enough to breathe like a man and not a barometer. Next came the letter to Drew. I typed and printed because paper stands where talk retreats. I reiterated the 72-hour bank deadline and the noon rule. I set contact limits for my time away, 2 calls a week, no money talk. I listed the warehouse addresses, the budgeting counselor at the church, the clinic that would right-size my prescriptions, and the community college night section in basic carpentry. I promised a mitigation letter if he self-reported and unwound or converted the loan. I stated plainly that after this month I would not pay rent or co-sign anything. I signed with Ruth's fountain pen so the ink carried a history I trusted. Courtesy to Mr. Rahman took 3 sentences. I confirmed cessation of transfers, provided Drew's contact for all rent matters, and thanked him for the verification letter he'd already sent. I printed the email, time-stamped my log, and clipped the sheet beneath the sleeve labeled Statement, Rent. Paper doesn't need belief, it needs sequence. Risk has housekeeping. I reconfirmed the credit freezes, added fraud alerts, changed email passwords to phrases my hands would remember, and uploaded recordings and scans to a cloud folder the clinic attorney could open. I printed a hard copy set and slid it into the fireproof box under the hall table. Putting a place around fear gives it less reach. I knocked on Frank Doyle's door with a spare key and an itinerary. "Water the spider plant if it sulks," I said. He nodded once. "Copy that." I left Dr. Chin's number and asked him to text if the mail grew fussy. He pocketed the key like a modest assignment and did not offer advice I hadn't asked for. Good neighbors leave room for your backbone to work. After lunch, I drove to the cemetery with flowers Ruth would have called sensible. The air over the Blue Ridge carried a memory of snow. I cleaned the granite with my handkerchief and said the promise out loud. I will not turn love into a chain. Beneath the vase, I tucked a folded note with the sentence I've been using to keep myself straight. Help is a spell, not a system. The wind moved through the cedars as if to agree. Packing, I kept to 1 carry-on. The chisel roll, a marking knife honed honest, a square, 2 shirts that could be washed in a sink and dried on a chair, the pawn ticket, not for penance but witness, Ruth's fountain pen for signatures I could live with. A small framed photo of us in the old shop, sawdust bright in the sunlight between us. On the shop door I hung a fresh cedar placard with black letters. Back in 30 days, working on something new. The sign looked younger than I felt, and that seemed right. In the attic, tugging down the travel bag, a thinner dust caught the light. Inside a box, I found an envelope in Ruth's hand I had never opened. The paper rasped like a whisper. Within lay a savings bond and a note that read like breath. For Drew, redeemable after 6 consecutive months of self-reliance. It carried conditions the way a compass carries north. I photographed the letter and sent the image to Drew with one line. Your mother believed you could stand. So do I. Conditions apply. The original went into the firebox where vows live safer than in hearts alone. I confirmed Dr. Chin's held ticket, purchased it with my own card, and forwarded the itinerary to Frank and to my log. On the hall table, I placed a clean copy of the acknowledgement and apology draft where Drew would see it if he came by to practice honesty. The city report stayed open in draft on the laptop, ready like a plane you hope you never need to board. Readiness can be a mercy when it keeps you from panic. Evening lowered its lid over Asheville. I set a suitcase by the door, squared the folders on the desk, and checked the alarm for an early flight. The kitchen clock kept ordinary time again. I turned off lights room by room until the house itself felt like a tool put back where it belongs. Gratitude surprised me, the kind that comes when you stop pretending you must fix what you did not break. In the doorway, I stood a moment longer, listening to the settled quiet of beams that have chosen their load and bear it. To the rooms and to the part of myself that had almost forgotten how to choose, I said one line, not for drama, but for structure. I choose the road that returns me to myself. The plane lifted into a peach strip of morning and set down beneath a sky the color of fired clay. Santa Fe's air felt drier, more exact. It entered the lungs like a statement and not a plea. Dr. Maya Chin met me at the curb with a thermos of tea and directions that needed only one turn. The casita out back of her studio was adobe and honest, low doorway, whitewashed niches, a Kiva fireplace blackened from being useful. Chile ristras hung like red punctuation beside a blue door. I set my bag down and realized how long it had been since a room felt earned rather than defended. I slept that first afternoon the way wood rests in clamps, held, not helpless. In the studio, usefulness returned geometry to my days. The students arrived with careful hands and lives that had sanded them to patience, a retired nurse with a steady wrist, an ex-miner whose palms told the truth, a janitor from a school who had saved more things than most people notice. I showed them how a marking knife teaches a line to mean it, how a square, if you let it, will argue with your eye until the joint closes. We planed with the grain until the boards began to sing a note you feel in your chest. When their faces lit, something in me put its tools back in the right drawer. I kept to my 2 calls a week rule with Asheville. Frank texted a photo of the spider plant looking better than it had under my care and wrote that the mail was unremarkable. Mr. Rahman sent a short email acknowledging all rent matters were routed to Drew now, neutral tone, good spine. I printed it and filed a copy in the gray sleeve I'd carried west like a passport. News from Drew came as a text shaped like a confession someone had practiced. Tessa had left to stay with her parents in Charlotte. He had spent 3 nights in his car. He'd moved into a motel off the highway whose carpet he did not describe. He attached a photo of a warehouse application receipt, timestamp visible. I replied with one line because a line was what we both could hold. Document everything. The bank wrote next. Their email confirmed receipt of the borrower's self-report and noted an investigation in progress. Repayment would be converted solely to Drew pending verification. The facts landed without ceremony and left room behind them where my ribs could lift. I added the notice to the red folder and wrote the time into my log. Relief registered as a checked box, not a hymn. On the city portal, the case toggled to preliminarily eligible for diversion contingent on restitution and a 1-session course about fraud. Adult Protective Services annotated my earlier call as information only. I drafted the mitigation letter I had promised, no adjectives, only dates and cooperation, and saved it in a folder labeled Not Yet. There is a dignity in waiting to send a thing until it has earned its stamp. Reputation, the most nervous thing in any town, began to settle. Drew posted a plain correction. I had paid 6 months' rent, he had forged consent, he was working with the bank and police. No self-pity, just nouns. I took screenshots and filed them beneath the rent sleeve. 2 neighbors who had reacted to Tessa's post sent brief apologies, which I answered with, "Thank you." Polite truth travels farther than victory laps. In the evenings, with cedar smoke sneaking under the casita door, I carved a thin maple leaf from scrap. I chased the veins with the tip of a knife until the light could read them. Late season changes do not need spring to be real. They need attention and patience and a refusal to pretend the year is over. I left the leaf on the windowsill to remind me the desert prizes what is exact. A clinic doctor in town reviewed my prescriptions and shook her head at what I'd been doing with halves. We set the dosage right and spoke for 3 minutes about stubborn fathers who think thrift beats chemistry. The cuff reading that night settled lower than my worry had allowed for weeks. I walked Canyon Road at dusk, past galleries with small lamps, past adobe shadows that look like kindness when the sun slides away. Breath found a cadence that was not a negotiation. Drew called within limits, voice smaller but not broken. He'd taken a night shift at a distribution warehouse and registered for a basic carpentry class at the community college. He did not ask for anything. He reported steps as if they were rungs. His sentences were shorter, cleaner, almost measurable. I told him to send copies, pay stub, registration confirmation, any emails that proved time met action. When we hung up, I wrote the call into the log and felt the shape of a new paragraph forming under his name. Back in the casita, I pinned the day's receipts and screenshots into their folders, then held the maple leaf to lamplight. It read like a map of routes across terrain I could finally name. Consequence, then repair. Truth, then work. The Kiva fire ticked toward coals. Outside, a coyote took inventory of his own hunger and moved on. I sat a while in the kind of quiet that repairs more than it breaks. The phone buzzed against the table with an unknown Charlotte number. I let it ring twice and watched the screen without touching it, the way a man studies a board before deciding where to cut. There is a difference between readiness and reaction. On the third ring, I silenced the call and wrote the number into the log with a note. Likely Tessa's father. Underneath, I wrote one more sentence as a brace against whatever talk might follow. Paper before voices, facts before heat. The leaf cooled in my palm. The room held. Tomorrow I would teach a class how to square a box that wanted to twist, and then I would square the call with the same tools. I returned the Charlotte number at a time I chose, speaker on, notebook open, the casita window catching square light on the table. Tessa's father answered with the confidence of men who build large things for a living. He used the word defamation as if it were a level he could set on my head. I let him finish the paragraph and said only what the situation required. Please put any concerns in writing. I'll respond through counsel. It wasn't a dare, it was a box. After we hung up, I wrote a contemporaneous summary, date, duration, substance, and emailed it to myself, then clipped the printout into the log. Paper before heat. I forwarded the call to the community clinic. The attorney replied with a spare paragraph that stacked like good lumber. Statements I'd made were documented facts, transfer receipts, landlord, letter, bank case, ID, Drew's public correction. Further threats might trigger a counter-response for baseless intimidation. All parties were asked to preserve communications. I filed the PDF under a new tab, Third Party, Monroe, and felt my lungs find their old shape. A shield is not a weapon. It keeps weather off your work so you can keep working. That afternoon, the bank confirmed conversion of the loan to Drew alone, pending verification of his first payment. I sent the mitigation letter I had drafted weeks ago, just dates, behaviors, cooperation, and filed the bank's acknowledgement in bank, fraud. The city portal kept its quiet bureaucratic promise, diversion eligible, hold. A PS remained information only, a phrase that sounded like a doorman who knows your name. Boundaries need rehearsal or they go out of tune. In a short call within our limits, I restated our 3 rules to Drew and followed with an email so he could file them where panic couldn't erase them. No cash, only information and introductions. Everything in writing, counseling, and skill building over bailouts. He answered with attachments that clicked like joints. First pay stub, motel receipt, class registration. Received, I wrote back. Keep copies. Next, budget sheet and the bank's payment confirmation. Skill, not rescue. In Dr. Chin's studio, surrounded by the kind of silence that tools enjoy, I propped my phone and filmed a short demonstration, how to build a simple shop jig that makes repeatable cuts for a starter stool. I narrated in the low voice I use when talking to myself at the bench. Mark, score, align, clamp, test, then commit. I scanned 2 jig plans and annotated them with a pencil where wisdom beats perfection. I sent the files and added a note about market booths, price cards, and why you don't discount to hide mistakes. A maker who underprices his work teaches his hands to lie. Dr. Chin asked if I could stay 2 extra weeks to help stage a student showcase. The class had begun to make things that belonged in the same room as pride. We talked wall labels, fair pricing, and the short talk I could give on hand tools as memory keepers. I said yes. It would give them a runway and give Drew space to operate without my shadow cast long across his days. Useful as a form of rest, I recognize. My body acknowledged the new order by doing what bodies do when you stop bargaining with them. The pharmacy filled the corrected prescriptions. The numbers on my pocket notebook climbed toward acceptable. I walked Canyon Road at dusk, passing adobe walls that held light the way old wood holds warmth. Sleep arrived without conditions. In the mornings, I woke with a clarity I had mistaken for months as selfishness. Reputation, once panicked, began to breathe. 2 neighbors from Asheville forwarded links where Drew's correction had been shared without comment. I took screenshots and tucked them into statement, rent. Frank texted, all calm. Plant smug, I sent back a photo of the maple leaf carving on the casita sill and wrote, still sanding. Some conversations are better at the speed of wood. I sorted the folders on the casita table as if I were laying out chisels. Bank, fraud, hard facts, statement, rent, third party, Monroe, and log. I printed an index page with each section and a list of contents, slid it into the front sleeve, and packed a duplicate into the firebox list for home. I messaged Frank to check the box in a week and text me a thumbs up. System survives storms that personalities can't. Drew emailed a budget worksheet that looked like someone had finally met his own month. He attached a calendar screenshot of night shifts and class nights, the grid of it honest and undramatic. Is this realistic? He wrote in the body. I replied with 2 adjustments, build a small buffer line for late fees and use an envelope method for groceries so cash can't argue with appetite. I added 1 sentence at the end and let it stand like a dowel through a joint. Add 1 line labeled savings, even if it's $5. People do not become steady by luck. They practice steadiness in amounts that look insulting to crisis. Back in the studio courtyard, the seniors' first finished pieces lined a bench. A tray that sat true, a dovetailed box with the dovetails still learning, a stool that stood on all 4 feet without apology. I wrapped a template for Drew's starter stool and slid a card into the packet with a single instruction. Do not force the cut. Let the line guide you. I addressed the small box to Asheville and set it on Dr. Chin's desk to mail with the studio run. At the laptop, I booked my return flight for 2 weeks out and copied the itinerary to Frank and to the log. The casita held a friendly quiet, the kind a house makes when it understands you are not asking it to fix anything, only to shelter a choice. Evening laid long rectangles across the floor. I stood at the threshold and watched dust lift and settle in them like a patient demonstration of gravity. The work ahead looked ordinary, and that felt like a gift. I had a class to prepare, a showcase to plan, a son learning to be a man in documents and in hours, and a stack of folders that could answer questions without waking rage. Home would come next, not the way it used to be, the way it could hold us now. I flew back into Asheville under a sky the color of wet slate, the mountains shouldering the low clouds like men who knew how to work. Frank met me in the arrivals lane with the spare key and 2 sentences that set the tone. House is fine. Plants thriving. We drove without decorating the silence. At home, I opened windows, let the southern humidity fold itself over the rooms, and walked straight through to the shop to turn on the lights that make steel smell cool. On the bench, I laid the casita souvenirs that were not souvenirs, a framed photo from Santa Fe, the maple leaf carving, Ruth's pen. Then I brought the binders in from my bag and put them on a shelf I labeled with a black marker: structure, bank, fraud, hard facts, statement, rent, third party, Monroe log. I printed an index and slid it into the front sleeve. Above the shelf, I framed a card with Ruth's sentence: help is a spell, not a system. Drew arrived the next morning between shifts, posture a degree truer than it had been. He set a manila envelope on the bench as if it might move if not watched. Inside, pay stubs, bank payment confirmations, a class attendance sheet with ink still drying, and a budget worksheet with an actual savings line. He lifted a starter stool from his trunk, the one built from my jig plan. The angles met like they'd agreed beforehand. The small imperfections were named and corrected. I logged each receipt and copied them for the files. Paper changed the air again, the way fresh shavings sweeten a room that's been closed too long. We didn't announce reconciliation, and we didn't hide. On Saturday, we rented a half table for him beside mine at the market. He priced fairly and refused haggling that insulted the work. Customers tapped the stool's feet. It stood true. 2 neighbors stopped and said, "Glad you're back." I said, "Me too," and left it there. The bank closed its loop with a short email: conversion complete, first payment posted. The city portal ticked to diversion accepted, contingent on continued restitution. A PS archived the file as informational. I printed everything and filed it where it belonged. In the log, I wrote the dates that mattered and the fees that taught. It read like a ledger of expensive lessons paid for with something other than money. 6 months passed like a season you actually lived through. Work, class, sleep, repeat. Receipts arrived when they should. I took the firebox key from the hook and opened to the envelope in Ruth's hand I had not touched since Santa Fe. The savings bond lay on its quiet paper like a leaf that had waited for a wind worth riding. I told Drew where it came from, what it meant, the condition that had been met. He nodded and said, "Tools and a security deposit." I told him to split it by percentage and keep copies of everything beside the letter. He did not argue with math. Boundaries that work deserved a home of their own. I typed a 1-page family operating guide and printed 2 copies. Rule 1, no cash transfers, in-kind help only with receipts. Rule 2, any support must be written with end dates. Rule 3, counseling and skills before rescue. We initialed and dated like adults buying a small company. I filed it under hard facts and felt the shelf settle as if the wall itself approved. A certified letter from Monroe Council arrived with impersonal punctuation. They considered the matter closed. I filed it under third party, Monroe, and added 1 line to the log. Silence restored. The house resumed its older habits: mail on the hall table, the clock's modest authority, the way afternoon light pools at the shop doorway like a good dog. Autumn gathered. I announced a free Saturday demo, hand tools as memory keepers, for seniors at the market. The sign-up sheet filled with familiar names: a barber with tired wrists, a widow who wanted to fix a drawer her husband had avoided, a woman who said her father's plane still smelled like him. I hung the Santa Fe photo by the shop door and felt the room lean toward usefulness the way trees lean toward a stream. Together, Drew and I built a quiet week. He worked nights, I turned bowls in the mornings, and in the afternoons we shared the bench without tripping over each other's gravity. I asked a handful of questions the way you ask a board if it's ready to cut, and he answered with documents instead of promises. I showed him a faster way to true a leg without cheating the line, and he showed me a phone calendar with alarms named for bills. We spoke in complete sentences and did not audit each other's souls. One evening I framed the maple leaf from Santa Fe with a thin strip of oak saved from the rack I built the year I bought the Diston saw. The grain ran like a faint river through drought, stubborn and sufficient. The leaf's veins glinted under glass like roads crossed and recrossed until you know how long each one really is. I hung it above the structure shelf, a ledger closed in wood. At the next market, Drew sold 2 stools and a tray to a couple who brought back the children who would sit on them. He didn't lower the price to make the sale. He told the story of the joinery and let value do its own talking. I watched him wrap the tray in butcher paper and tie it with twine, fingers steady, and felt the angle settle between us. Not one man rescuing and one being rescued, but two craftsmen standing where the truth set them down. Back home, lamps warmed the shop. Shavings curled like commas across the floor, the day writing itself into a paragraph I didn't want to edit. I pulled Ruth's pen from its place and filled the log with one steady sentence. We stood where the truth set us down and built from there. I capped the pen and listened to the house breathe like a creature that knows its weight and chooses it. Two stools stood side by side without leaning, his and mine, both square enough to carry what came next. Night settles like finish on oak, thin coats, patient strokes, a sheen you earn. The market tent is folded in the truck, the cash box counted, the last thank you said. In the shop I sweep until the floor speaks its soft rasp. Shavings gather in low drifts like a quiet weather I don't mind. The lamps make small pools of amber. Ruth's pen waits beside the LOG, cap set down exactly where habit keeps finding it. Two stools stand square under the maple leaf from Santa Fe, their shadows clean, his and mine, parallel without leaning. If there is a single lesson that outlived the storm, it is this. Love and rescue are cousins who shouldn't live in the same house. Love stands with you and sometimes stands aside. Rescue elbows in and makes a mess of everyone's hands. I thought I could hide mercy in a transfer and call it dignity. I halved pills, sold a saw I meant to teach a grandson to hold, and told myself quiet was the same as respect. It wasn't. Respect is a boundary written down, signed, and kept when it trembles. Paper saved us, not as shield alone, but as shape. Receipts laid a floor where talk kept slipping. Statements marked the hours when memory wanted to edit. Letters put a fence around heat so it didn't jump the ditch and light the field. Frank Doyle reminded me that logs matter because time is a witness with a long memory. Mr. Rahman kept a ledger that told the story without adjectives. The clinic translated the ache in my chest into steps a city understands. When people say community, I now think of clamp pressure, not loud, just steady enough to set the joint. Consequences came before repair, and that order turned the room. Facts landed on the table. They made their own weather. Drew met them with hours at a warehouse, with night classes that smelled like sawdust and second chances, with payments that posted on the days they said they would. He put a savings line on a budget that used to be all appetite and apology. We wrote a family operating guide as dry as a shop manual, initialed and dated, and filed it where it would stare us down if we tried to forget. Respect came back not as a feeling, but as a practice. I have learned there is such a thing as late season change. Santa Fe taught it in Adobe and Afternoon Light. Dr. Maya Chin handed me a studio key and a month of usefulness that fit like an old jacket. Seniors showed up with histories longer than their tool lists and made boxes that kept more than tea. I said the same things a dozen ways. Follow the grain, let the line guide the cut, dry fit first, glue once, and realized I was saying them to myself. A man past 60 is not a spent board. He's hardwood cured enough to hold a clean edge if he stops soaking in other people's storms. For the parents my age, the ones who keep a coat on the back of a chair in case a grown child knocks at midnight, it is not cruelty to keep the chair and ask for a plan. Set one firm no so a better yes has somewhere to stand. Put help on paper with end dates and signatures. Give information, introductions, and the kind of attention that asks for proof. Refuse the flattery of being needed in ways that stunt. You are not a doormat, you are a threshold. People should step over, not grind you into the grain. For adult children, and I say this with the same tenderness I tried to remember when my son was small, respect is measurable. It shows up as punctual payments, as photos of receipts, as prices that honor the hours your hands cannot get back. Ask for guidance, not rescue. Add savings even when it's the price of a cup of coffee. Habit, not amount, makes the shape of a life. If you forged a signature, unforge it with hours and honesty. Apologies are good wood, restitution is the glue. Reputation did not need a parade to come home. It arrived the way mail should, on time, in order, with enough light to read by. 2 neighbors nodded at the market, that was plenty. The rest lived in the shelf I labeled structure, folders squared, index crisp, Ruth's sentence framed above them where I can see it the way sailors read stars. When people ask how we fixed it, I tell them we didn't. We built something true and let the false fall off by itself. The tools have their own parable. The carving knife that once lay too close to a bad moment now rides its hook, sharp and at peace. The fountain pen, black lacquer, gold nib that remembers grocery lists and condolences, does the important lifting, logs, letters, the guide we signed. I have become a man who reaches for ink before edge, who believes that a line in a ledger can be a kindness. The maple leaf bright under glass reminds me that endings are a kind of design, not a defeat. I open the log and write slow so the sentence can hear itself. I thank the room, which is one of the ways I thank Ruth. I think of Santa Fe and Canyon Road at dusk, of the Casitas Kiva flame, of older students whose patience could teach water to settle. I think of Frank's clamp on my counter and Mr. Rahman's PDFs, of the clinic's calm emails, of the day Drew's budget looked like a month that had finally found its spine. A line is left to say, and it is better simple than clever. I write it to Ruth, to Drew, and to anyone who ever stood at a bench with a heart they couldn't square. We stood where the truth set us down and built from there. I cap the pen and place it on the card that holds her sentence. The lamps go dark with practiced clicks. The shop gives back one last woody breath and rests. Beyond the doorway, the house breathes evenly, a creature sure of its weight. The stools keep their square under the leaf, 2 useful shapes, no leaning. I pull the door until the latch catches and feel the frame answer. Flush, true, enough. In the end, what remains is not the sting of a single insult or the smoke of one hard night. What lasts is the shape we give to truth when we finally stop arguing with it. Boundaries written down, promises kept the slow way, dollars accounted for without shame. These are ordinary tools, but they rebuild trust the way careful hands rebuild a chair. One square joint at a time. Mercy without math can feel like love, yet it quietly teaches dependence. Accountability can feel like coldness, yet it quietly restores dignity. Between those two lies a steady road, help that never hides the bill, care that never cancels consequence. Repair is never instant. It moves in the honest cadence of habit. Hours worked, receipts saved, budgets that tell the month the truth. Respect returns as a practice, not a speech. And reputation, the most nervous thing in any town, comes back the same way it left. By foot, in order, carrying paper. If there is a compass for late-season change, it points to 3 simple disciplines. Put facts before heat, help without erasing responsibility, and choose the cut that saves the peace, even when the cut is to our own comfort. There is power in starting over at an age when many are told to wind down. Later life is not a cul-de-sac, it is a high, clear road where the grain in the wood finally shows. The years that sanded us also seasoned us. With the right pressure and the right time, glue holds. With the right boundaries, love holds too. We do not need to be rescued to be valued. We need to be met with steady expectations and the faith that growth can come after harvest. The proof is plain: where truth is honored, peace becomes possible. Where limits are respected, affection can breathe again. The quiet hero of this kind of story is structure. Written agreements, receipts, and statements, a simple guide on one page that says what help is and what it isn't. These are not punishments, they are handrails. They keep the next step honest and give everyone involved a way to measure progress without guessing. When people know the terms, pride can coexist with humility. When support has an end date, gratitude can coexist with independence. So the lesson is less about winning and more about building. Build boundaries that protect love. Build habits that outlast emotion. Build lives that can be audited by daylight. If a moment comes when you must choose, choose the action that preserves what is true, even if it costs comfort in the short run. That is how families become places of steadiness instead of stages for performance. That is how a name becomes something you can sign without flinching. Thank you for spending your time here. If something in this journey resonated, if a line gave you courage, or a small detail reminded you of your own turning point, share it in the comments and tell us what stayed with you. Your stories make this space more than a screen. They make it a workshop where hard things are shaped into honest things. If you found value, please like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you won't miss what comes next. Most of all, add your voice. The community we're building together is proof that even late in the day, light can still fall exactly where it's needed.